Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Association of the United States Army's 2019 Conference and Trade Show here in Washington, D.C., the #1 gathering of U.S. Army leaders from around the world. Our coverage here is sponsored by General Motors Defense, Bell, L3 Harris, and Leonardo DRS, and it's my honor to be talking to Michael Baer, the chairman of the Defense Business Board, good friend, and also somebody who spent most of his career thinking about complex innovation. Michael, how many AUSAs is this for you?
I don't know, Vago, but it wouldn't be AUSA if it wasn't with you. So it's good to see you here. Good to be back amongst all these fabulous soldiers.
It is great, and in fact, full disclosure, Michael and I actually met a little bit before AUSA in 1992, if I remember correctly, and it was an innovative and thoughtful conversation then, and I want to bring you back around on that. But first, one of the things that you've talked about and we've talked about is a concern whether or not we as an American military have a great reputation of telling ourselves how great we are and talking more about how it is we'd like to fight than spending time talking about how adversaries will fight us. I know you have conversations at the senior-most level on this and that we've talked about that progress. Tom Earhart has been studying that as well, the strategist, and a little bit of concern about whether or not we're making that transition. From your standpoint, do you think that senior leadership has its arm wrapped around the incredibly novel and maybe completely game-changing ways our adversaries may choose to fight us?
Well, Vago, it's a terrific question, and the dimensions of it are what make this really tough. Because surrounded by all this wonderful technology, some of this stuff is so far beyond cutting edge, it's eye-watering. But ultimately, this stuff only works if you got the right people and the right leaders. And for 25 years, the US military grew up without having a peer competitor. And today, all of that has changed with this really highly aggressive competition we're facing from China and Russia. And so therefore, the leadership has got to be able to convey a whole different sense of the consequence of things to their staffs and to their individual soldiers. Today, that's their greatest challenge, is inculcating their vision, their understanding of the problem, and getting that inculcated in depth in the institution. It's a tough, tough challenge, hard to do.
But the concern is that we want to fight adversaries the way we imagine we'd like to fight them, right? The Navy is always fond of talking about, well, the aircraft carrier is still very, very useful, even if the adversary may have gotten beyond the aircraft carrier in some ways on how they're going to fight. Or, for example, what happens to mass formations at a time when you have hypersonic weapons with area denial capabilities? I understand the idea of understanding and inculcating, but are we inculcating the right things given that our adversaries are going to fight in such fluid, hybrid ways to include precursor cyber operations, high-intensity disinformation operations? Do you think that we have a handle on that from a senior leadership standpoint?
Vago, I think we're really struggling with that. We have to build those really complex models, the really complex simulations, because you can speak about it endlessly, but until someone experiences the bitterness of defeat in a game, or in a model, or in a simulation, that's the beginning of true enlightenment. We found that with Top Gun in the Navy, way eons ago, and the Army at the National Training Center. There is just no substitute for that kind of experience in changing culture and getting people really oriented. But the hard part is to staff that objectively, having people who are building those environments, testing those systems, who are absolutely beholden to no one but the leadership to keep the whole process honest.
Because that's right, if you have a war game that's tilted in favor of supporting one of your ideas or your projects, that's not really an objective war game.
Exactly, the only person that will be fooled is yourself, and you'll be fooled very painfully. Graveyards are full of people who went into war with an illusion of superiority and came face to face with the realities of a creative, innovative enemy.
Let me take you to the question of cyber. You helped spearhead a cyber assessment for the Secretary of the Navy, Richard V. Spencer. It was an unvarnished look at cyber vulnerabilities. We had a very, very interesting conversation about that soon after that report came out. time and again, when I talk to the senior leaders, they confide in me that they understand the operational art. They know land warfare, air warfare, naval warfare, have a functional understanding of special operations, but say that they fall short when it comes to cyber operations, the electromagnetic spectrum, and that's even before we get to 5G, AI, big data. How do you think we have to change how we think and how we train? Because all too often, senior leaders will point to a 1-star or a colonel on their staff and say, well, I got a guy who does cyber, I got a guy who does EW. How do we need to think about this?
Well, I had a lot of people point that very way when I was doing the study. And so, Vago, I actually think it's how you think about it. Once upon a time, all of these leaders saw themselves in the business of tanks or aircraft or whatever it might be, logistics. Today, the common thread through all of that is information. So if the current generation and the future generation of leadership don't understand information, how to keep it resilient, how to defend it from cyber, then they're really, really ill prepared for the challenges they're going to face. It's the essential element of the enterprise now. All those other terms of reference, the gentleman you were speaking of, and his competencies, those are all now secondary to being able to master the information domain. Without it, the others simply won't work. And in fact, they become huge handicaps. Expensive, cost-imposing, unworkable things if you don't have really, really good information dominance.
I was just in Yerevan for the World Congress on Information Technology, as you know. It was a great defense panel, and Richard Clark has been one of the folks who's been saying for the longest time that actually each one of us is an information enterprise that does different things with it, which is a similar theme to what you've been talking about for a long time as well. The nature of change, and I'll end in a moment about personnel, but we are at a time, we try to tell ourselves that it's unprecedented change and it's tectonic change, but actually we as a society have gone through these periods roughly every 100 years or so. If you look at it, it was 100 years ago where the United States Army, with extraordinary speed, mechanized, seized on radio communications, certainly pioneered a lot of these capabilities and looked at these capabilities before World War I, but that was an incredible decade that we went through. Electrification of the force as well being something. How unprecedented is what we're going through now? And what are some ways to think about fundamental tectonic change, the likes of which we're going through now with the information revolution?
Well, I think, Vago, that you're exactly right. The beginnings of knowledge in this is to understand this is just another one of these massive changes the Army has to go through, and the military as well. But it is best done. How do you think about it? You think about it by getting the best possible people. You bring them into the world they need to be, and don't assume that it's a seamless, instantaneous change. 25 years of no peer threat has inculcated a whole set of values, frankly confidences, that are not necessarily material in today's world. And the leadership that it tackles that the best, as it has in the past, generates a really winning team. And I think that is really the secret that this Army is trying to do right now, and I really compliment them for it.
General Jim McConville, the 40th Chief of Staff of the United States Army, we had a conversation with him, and one of the things that his number one priority is to get the people side of the equation right, to get the personnel management side of it. You have been on so many of these boards to recommend how better to use personnel. And it looks like that's one of the things that he's trying to do is identify all the skill sets of everybody who wears the Army uniform, and let's actually pick the right person for the right job, as opposed to just putting a person in a job. Talk to us a little bit about how, and I know you've had some of these conversations as well in an advisory capacity, but what are the keys to remember to try to do this right? Because you also look for lessons in private enterprise that can be applicable to the military as well, and your guys as the Defense Business Board Chairman.
Well, Vago, the people equation is the heart of the successes we've talked about. And I think one of the things that General Jim McConville is trying to do, is the former head of personnel for the Army, is to try to figure out how to really get the right people in the right jobs and be able to find those skills and extract them when you need them. He's seeing an Army that's no longer just a group of platoons and companies, battalions, and so on. But he's seeing a collection of really discrete skill sets, and then how do you harness those using technology to attack the challenges you're facing. It's also important to recognize that with the really expanding computational capability that we've got, a fair number of the jobs that the Army has right now that's adding to its personnel bill won't exist in 5 and 10 years. If you think about how in the private sector, IT has revolutionized employment patterns, I think you'll see those same kinds of things happen to the Army, and its need to, as it does right now, to bring in 80,000 people a year in order to maintain its strength. It should be capable in the years ahead to be able to be even more lethal and more capable with even a smaller force than it's got now, as it substitutes all of those back office skills that we think about and substitutes those with information dominant capability.
That goes though to the idea of what future war is going to look like, right? If you automate truck drivers, for example, you don't need as many truck drivers to be doing it. You can free those up for combat. It's not to say that anybody who's driving a convoy is not a combatant, right? That's not the case I'm making. But to be much more of a trigger puller at the end of the day, to be more on the tooth side of the equation. If you talk to theorists, their notion of future advantage in a future conflict will be fleeting. We're a nation who's gotten very accustomed to decades-long military advantages, right? 40 years in the second offset, whereas Bob Work has theorized that it's 5 to 10 years for the third offset, and actually many people say it may be even more fleeting than that, where advantage is exchanged in 5-minute increments. What's your sense on what advantage looks like and the importance of resilient, adaptive people, right? Because it does boil down to talent at that point, right? To see advantage and capitalize on it.
Yeah, no, Vago, that's precisely the challenge, is to stay ahead of not so much the enemy or the opponent, but to stay ahead of the technology. We are in a world where in commercial advantage, things are fleeting. Stuff is obsolete within weeks or months or days. That kind of time pressure, driven by both creative people and really advancing technology, is the world that this Army will face. And in order to counter that, you're going to need equivalencies of the old combat arms training board notions of Paul Gorman eons ago, of really trying to rapidly adapt an institution prepared for Vietnam and getting it ready for a new world, except that it won't be just one of those, there'll be multiples running in parallel, working all the different alternatives going forward. It's a really different paradigm, but for survival, essential.
Michael Baer, Chairman of the Defense Business Board, good friend, advisor. Sir, thanks very much, always.
Delight
it's a pleasure.
to be with you. Thank you.
And well, I guess we have to say a hooah to the United States Army.
Yes, beat Navy.